Imagine an idea so powerful it could literally reshape the world. Today, we're going to dive into a theory that was born from the ashes of a global crisis, the Orthodox Keynesian school. And let me tell you, this wasn't just some new economic model, it was a completely radical new way of thinking about a government's role in all of our lives. To really get why this matters, you have to understand the stakes, and, well, they don't get much higher than this. The economist Robert Mundell actually believed that if governments had understood these ideas sooner, we might have avoided not just the Great Depression, but also World War II. I mean, this isn't just theory. This is world-altering stuff. So, how did this whole revolution happen? Well, we'll kick things off in the absolute chaos of the Great Depression, and then we'll get to the radical idea that changed everything. We're going to unpack the toolkit policymakers used, look at the tough choices it created, and finally, see how its core beliefs are still making waves in our world today. All right, so our story begins in a world that was just plunged into chaos. The Great Depression wasn't just a failure of banks and businesses, it was a total failure of ideas. The big economic theories of the time, they just couldn't explain what on earth was going on. You see, before the 1930s, the classical view was king. The belief was pretty simple. Just leave markets alone and they'll always fix themselves. But as the Depression got deeper and deeper, reality painted a very different picture. We're talking mass unemployment, demand just vanishing, the promised self-correction, it never came. It was painfully obvious that the old rulebook was totally useless. So into this intellectual vacuum steps a man named John Maynard Keynes, and he proposed an idea that was, for the time, completely and utterly radical. He basically argued that the classical economists had it all backward. The problem wasn't supply, the problem was a catastrophic economy-wide failure of demand. And this right here is the core of the Keynesian revolution, this idea of an underemployment equilibrium. I want you to think of it like a car that's run out of gas. It's perfectly stable, right? It's in equilibrium, but it's not going anywhere. Keynes argued an entire economy could get stuck just like this, perfectly balanced, but with millions of people out of work, simply because there wasn't enough spending to fuel the engine. No magical invisible hand was coming to the rescue. So, if a lack of demand is the problem, how do you fix it? Keynes's answer was something he called the multiplier effect, and it's a really beautiful, simple idea. If the government spends money, let's say $100 to build a bridge, that's not where the story ends. The worker who gets that money, they spend it. The shopkeeper who gets that money then spends it again. Now, each round of spending gets a little smaller, but that initial injection of cash just ripples through the whole economy, creating a much larger impact on national income. And here is the little bit of math, the engine behind that ripple effect. The size of the multiplier really all comes down to this letter C, the marginal propensity to consume. In plain English, that's just how much of each extra dollar do people actually spend versus save. So if people spend 90 cents of every new dollar, C is 0.9. You plug that in and boom, the multiplier is 10. That means every single dollar of government spending actually generates $10 of economic activity. The more people spend, the bigger that ripple. Now, Keynes's ideas were incredibly powerful, right? But his followers, they needed a way to formalize them, to turn them into a practical model for policymakers. And this led to the development of what became the absolute workhorse of Keynesian economics for decades, the ISLM model. Okay, so the first piece of this puzzle is the IS curve. This basically represents the real economy, goods and services. All you really need to know is this. When interest rates are low, it's cheaper for businesses to borrow and invest in new projects. And more investment means more economic output. So it's a simple relationship. Low rates, high output. That's why it slopes down. The second piece is the LM curve, and that represents the money market. It's kind of the flip side. When the economy is booming and output is high, there are way more transactions happening, so people and businesses need more cash on hand. This higher demand for money pushes up its price, which is the interest rate. So again, simple relationship. High output, high rates. The economy finds its sweet spot right where these two IS and LM curves cross. But here is the magic for policymakers. You can actually shift these curves. Want to boost the economy? Easy. Use fiscal policy. That means increase government spending or cut taxes, and that shifts the IS curve to the right. Or you could use monetary policy. Increase the money supply to shift the LM curve to the right. Either way, both actions lead to higher output and more jobs. This model gave governments a clear visual playbook for managing the economy. Building on this whole framework, another really powerful and honestly deceptively simple idea came along in the 50s and 60s. and it became an absolute cornerstone of Keynesian policymaking. It was called the Phillips curve. The original Phillips curve showed this really stable, inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. It was almost like a menu for the economy. Did you want super low unemployment? Sure, you could have it, but you'd have to live with higher inflation. More worried about inflation? Okay, you could bring it down, but that's going to cost you in terms of higher unemployment. For a while there, it really seemed like policymakers could just pick their favorite spot on the curve. I mean, this was the golden age of Keynesian demand management. It honestly seemed like the major economic problems had been solved. But there was this kind of crucial question looming in the background. Was this relationship truly stable? Could this simple trade-off really last forever? Well, the 1970s delivered a brutal answer. No. The world was hit by stagflation, this toxic mix of stagnating growth, high unemployment, and high inflation all at the same time. This real-world crisis, sparked by things like massive oil price shocks, dealt a huge blow to the simple Keynesian model because, well, the Phillips curve said this was impossible. And this cracked the door wide open for rival theories to come in and challenge its dominance. So the crisis of stagflation was a huge, huge challenge. But despite all that, the core ideas of Keynesianism have shown some remarkable staying power. So let's just boil it all down to the foundational beliefs that really define this school of thought. Okay, here are the 5 pillars. First, demand drives everything in the short run, period. Second, wages and prices are sticky. They don't just magically adjust overnight to fix problems. Third, because of that stickiness, the economy can get well and truly stuck with high unemployment. Fourth, private investment is unstable, often driven by gut feelings or what Keynes called animal spirits. And what do you get when you add all that up? The fifth and most important pillar, government can and absolutely should step in to stabilize things. So, after all that, what is the legacy of this revolution? Well, while the simple models from the 60s have definitely evolved, the core Keynesian insights are still shaping policy debates today. And the Nobel laureate James Tobin, one of America's top Keynesian economists, really put it perfectly. Take a look at this quote. Tobin is making a classic Keynesian argument right here. He's saying that when the economy is already in a slump, cutting government spending to try and reduce the deficit is exactly the wrong thing to do. It would just shrink the economy even more, it would hurt investment, and ultimately it would be worse for future generations. That is the Keynesian logic of countercyclical policy in a nutshell. Ultimately, what Tobin's saying really boils down to this simple but incredibly powerful idea. You have to suit the medicine to the patient. The core Keynesian insight is that a struggling economy is fundamentally different from a healthy one. When you're in a downturn, the normal rules about balancing budgets and letting markets do their thing, they just don't apply. The number one priority is to actively manage demand to get people back to work. And that, of course, brings us right to today. Keynesianism was born from a crisis of demand. But what about the challenges we're facing now? Pandemics that shatter supply chains, wars that create energy shocks, these are supply-side problems. So the question we're left with is a big one. Are the classic, demand-focused tools of Keynesianism still the right medicine for the economy of the 21st century?